So we have 6 more sessions of our 24 hours of PBL Plus, and this is the first of those 6. And we wanted to share some exceptional things happening in Australia, in New South Wales, as well as the vision of NuVu Studio, which began in Cambridge, began in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and grew to other locations around the world. And so we have Leanne Lesic, who is the head of school with the Kempsey Adventist School in Kempsey, North New South Wales. And if we're also fortunate, we'll have Andrea Thompson, who's an educator in a very small school in Toronto. We'll hear from them, and then Saba from NuVu will describe the rest of that. And I'd like to start with Leanne because I know Leanne the best. I don't know whether you would rather me ask you questions or whether you would like to share some things, but in particular, what I'm excited about seeing in the PBL journey at Kempsey is that when I was there in August, September, I caught the last few days of the Festival of Creativity. And there are all kinds of exciting things that were happening there, and either I can describe them and you can say, no, Nick, you got it wrong, or you can tell me and then I'll ask you some other additional questions. So up to you, Leanne. Do you want me to tell the story?
Sure.
Or do you want to tell it? Okay. Well, here's the essence of it, and then you can tell me where I'm on the wrong page. So at Kempsey, they intentionally interrupt the end of a term, and terms are about 10 weeks or so. And the last 7 days are terms where kids identify projects that they want to work on, and the adults join them. And the wonderful thing is that the adults do not join the students in their areas of expertise. So the science teacher is working in the food lab, and the math teacher is creating art, and the French teacher is out in the garden. And they're all getting dirt under their fingernails and dust in their hair right alongside of the kids, and learning with them instead of directing the learning of others. What I saw last fall, our fall, your spring, was a high level of engagement. I wouldn't say it's 100% engagement, but I would say it was easily 80% of the kids were deeply involved in these projects that they were working on. And I would say that that's the inverse of a normal school anywhere around the world. It would be more like 80% of the kids don't see the relevance of what they're doing. And some people have said it's even higher than that. So I saw them inverting that model. I saw inverting the model of the relationship between the educator and the student. And then the other things that I remember, maybe not so much from September, but in prior iterations of this, is low levels or maybe even non-existent reports for behavior. Students weren't being referred to assistant principals and deans and things like that. Because of the level of engagement, you didn't have these little explosions of behavioral issues. And if I'm remembering right, there weren't students who were saying, I'm so stressed by this, I need to go see one of the school counselors. And so what it opens up is the question of, wow, if we did this more often, could we redirect the adult resources on campus and meet the needs of students in new ways that don't have a collection of people addressing behavior and a collection of people addressing counseling issues and a high level of engagement to kids, et cetera. So that was the wonderful thing that I saw. And now Leanne will poke some holes in that and say, well, not quite that.
Yeah, so the journey probably began with Nick about 4 years ago. So a couple of other leaders and myself were blessed to travel to Harvard and do a 3-day learning environments for tomorrow course. And that truly was like a real pivotal point in our school journey. So quite traditional classroom where we work in a regional area in Australia, high poverty, lots of trauma. About a quarter of our school are Indigenous young people, and so our town has, separate to that, our town has quite big social challenges, 2 or 3 times the level of crime that other areas of the state have, etc. There's been a group of us that sort of were really challenged at that learning environments for tomorrow course to say, what are we doing? We literally were like, stop the buildings. And so tried to find a way to, Nick Salmon here introduced us to, that's how we met Nick. He introduced us to PBL, and then we found Jake Plaskett, who was a teacher who worked at High Tech High, who lives in Australia. And he came and ran a couple of days training with us, and that's how we birthed the Festival of Creativity. And that was 3 years ago. So when we started it, it was very teacher driven, like here's the projects, you sign up to what you're interested in. The second year we ran it, teachers put together projects and pitched it to the young people, and then they decided what ran or didn't. And so some of the staff had projects that didn't run. And then this last year, through last school year, we had it very much student driven. So students, it was their decision as to what the projects were, and staff signed up to it. And the reason that we initially started this was because we wanted to have a go at PBL in a low risk area. We have a number of staff. I think in the US you talk about I think the common standard or something to that effect. Our equivalent here is quite draconian, down to how many hours we have to teach different subjects. And so we wanted to have a go in a sort of having a go without all the stress that comes with, are we meeting our outcomes? And that's how we birthed the Festival of Creativity. And because we have a lot of young people that have or are experiencing trauma, we do have a wellbeing team with a couple of counsellors and wellbeing workers. And they, along with the deputy and myself, a flat chat every day, just basically supporting young people through some of the things they're dealing with. And the thing that really stands out to me in that, in our Festival of Creativity, as Nick touched on, is literally we had, from all of us being full on working with young people in that wellbeing space, in our Festival of Creativity, that literally dropped to 2 students, and those 2 had experienced a death. And so that was a specific event, but we did not have the constant stream of young people who aren't coping. So there's this balance of what they can't cope with, but also learning that's not engaging them. And so put that together, and they don't want to be in their classes. And to be honest, I don't blame them. So there's all sorts of things that they've been involved in. So we had young people. I think one really great example from last year is one of our students who needs a lot of mentoring. He really wanted to create a farm at school. And so that was one of the projects. And he led that project, and rather than being in trouble all day long as what he usually is, he actually led and was amazing. And that really challenged some of the staff mindsets around, I see this child in a particular way, but look, they've actually blossomed and grown. So part of this journey for us is also exploring student voice. And with the remote learning, pandemic stuff that's going on, I actually see it as an opportunity. So we start term 2 on Monday. So we've just had the technical break, but this week's been full on, and we're starting our term with literacy and numeracy delivered as it has been, but the rest of the time we've got a whole school project. and the whole school project is going to be based around the Rube Goldberg idea. And we're kicking that off on Tuesday. So we've got a day without students on Monday. And then our staff have been involved in PBL units for the 3 weeks that come after that. And that's relevant in this conversation because the government, because everything is so disrupted, has sort of eased expectations a little bit around making sure that we meet outcomes. And so we are totally using that to wedge in and have a play and actually have a go at PBL units outside of literacy and numeracy. Doesn't mean there won't be literacy and numeracy, but we're designing that particularly for engagement. That's our #1 driver, because we had 8 days of learning before the end of our term break. And what we saw was in this secondary school, so the year, the 12-year-olds to 18-year-olds, attendance was at its high 60% and down as low as 40%, and that was dropping off. So we're starting the term with trying to focus on engagement. And that means also that we're creating resource packs, because we literally have families that don't have pencils at home or devices. And so trying to find our way forward. So yeah, trying to continue the journey on student voice. And next week, the students will sign up to what projects they would like to be involved in. And my job on Monday is to prepare the staff that maybe some of their projects may not run. and we'll see how we go from there.
Nice. Good. I do have a video that we could queue up to talk about Toronto if we have some time, but maybe let's hear from Saba a little bit, and then, you know, we'll, as we've been doing recently, we'll just kind of go back and forth. So I think I need to unmute you, and there you go, Saba.
Okay. Hi, Nick.
Hi. So Saba, you happen to be in California, but NuVu is in Cambridge. It's in Mumbai, as I understand. I think it's like in Tampa, or at least you have little outposts in different parts of the world. So where, for people on this call that know nothing of NuVu, what's the essence of what's happening there, and why is it not just in Cambridge, Massachusetts anymore?
Yeah, so a little bit about NuVu, and thank you for everyone who's joining us in wherever part of the world you're streaming in from. So my name is Saba, and I'm one of the co-founders of NuVu. We started NuVu about 10 years ago, and what was the sort of prime reason for starting NuVu was really to bring creative learning to the forefront of education, and particularly in the K-12 space. And so we started the school based around a studio model. And the term studio comes from architecture. So my background is architecture, and 2 of my other co-founders, one is also an architect, another one was in computer science. But we really started the school to create a model of hands-on learning where students are working on interdisciplinary projects and looking at the real world and having the learning really reflect what's happening in the world around them. And so our entire focus as far as the curriculum is based on these interdisciplinary projects that happen within these 3-week-long studio intensives. So it's a very different structure. And we, from the very start, we mixed ages and grades. So we have 7th graders up to 12th graders working in a multi-age, multi-grade environment, alongside with coaches who come from different backgrounds, who lead these different studio topics. And so we started in Cambridge, and we have a school that's around 60 students. So it's a micro school. And what we've been doing over the last 4 years is taking that model, and we've sort of grown to work with schools all around the world. And we have a network of about 14 schools where we have NuVu programs embedded within the school. As Nick, you mentioned, one is in Florida. We have a number of schools around the Northeast, in Maine, Vermont, around the Massachusetts area, and it's a combination of public schools, private schools. We have a partner coming on this fall, which is in Hawaii, and it's a charter school. But what's really interesting is we take our fully immersive studio model and then adapt it to all of these different places that we're working, sometimes rural environments, urban environments, interesting cultural contexts. We have 2 schools which are based in Turkey, and primarily one of the schools is located in a very small town, which is made up of primarily refugees from Syria. So we're working in community centers, but really the gist is really how can we connect the studio topics to what's happening in the real world? And we do that across all of our schools. So what's been really interesting is everything that happened with COVID-19, as many schools, all schools, I'd say for the most part around the world, had to quickly transition, going from their being on site in school to suddenly a virtual environment. And our school in Cambridge, in addition to the 14 schools that we work with, had to transition very quickly. And being a sort of hands-on school where students are collaborating and that's part of their primary mode of learning, we had to also very quickly figure out how could that transition into virtual studios and what does that look like, not only in Cambridge, outside of Boston, but in all of these other schools, which are in all different areas with different types of populations of students. And what we'd at least tried to do in Boston and Cambridge, because our curriculum really reflects what's happening in the world, we sort of pivoted and we thought, okay, there's a lot of interesting challenges that the world is facing right now. And so our theme for the entire trimester was really geared around topics that resonated with the impact of COVID-19. So one of the studios was called Unplanned Tomorrows, and the students were actually looking at forms of communication in a world where suddenly people are isolated in their homes, and looking at different populations such as the elderly population, and how do you look at communication modes given this context, and what are the challenges, and what other means can you design and create that offer other modes of communication that aren't just verbal or Zoom based and visual, or really heavy, requires a lot of technology. So low tech means the communication. So that's just one example of a studio we ran. So we're always kind of looking at ways of connecting interesting challenges and bringing it into the scope of the studio work that's happening.
Yeah, when I think of the projects that I saw in Cambridge years ago, you had students out documenting homelessness, or I don't know, it seemed like they went through a cycle that there was, there was the Hack the Wheelchair there for a while when Syed was a student there. And and then you had the homeless project, and something about transportation, and then there was always a fashion show of found objects. And what was delightful about spending time in the studio for, I don't know, there were several times where I was there for 4 or 5 hours, and it always felt like about half an hour had gone by. But what I remember in particular there was all the iteration. It didn't matter what somebody was doing, whether it was making a piece of fashion, wearable fashion, or hacking the wheelchair or whatever. There was always just numerous iterations, way beyond anything you would normally see in any other kind of school setting. And it really spoke to that. You've created a maker culture, not a maker space. In that setting, I assume you've replicated that elsewhere.
Yeah, and that's a big part, is that focus on the rigor that comes from deeply researching, understanding the historical context, and constantly getting insight as you're developing or designing something in that process of iteration, and coming up with lots of versions of it, and evolving that design as you're getting insight from your clients or from users or from field research. And I think that's a big part that we focus on, is how students really express that learning and their thinking through sketches and their documentation that they're producing every day. And for that, they're documenting on NuVu's platform. And it's a big part of how they share the story of their thinking, and how that project has evolved, is really looking at those different iterations over the course of that studio. And that's a big kind of focus for us, in not just for looking at the final product, but how can we think about all that was learned through those intermittent steps. And as part of the student's final presentation, they walk through really from start to finish how that concept evolved, and also what types of kind of content areas do they tap into, and really expressing that as part of their final presentation.
And that reminds me that Saeed at Left last July was talking about new ways in which you're assessing student work in order to create something that will get them not just a high school diploma, but into a college or university. And I think that that's an issue for Leanne as well. Sorry, Leanne, I know you're trying to sleep.
I'm awake.
You're awake. In that, if we begin to depart from the expectations of what's next, that that feels risky, and yet I feel like you've done some effective things at being able to demonstrate that students are going to be highly effective in life after their high school, and or in combination with NuVu. So maybe you could tell a little bit of that, and maybe Leanne could reflect on the trepidation you have from departing from the expectations of the education department.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, thankfully, and not thankfully, but it's because we were able to create the school based on the studio model. It sort of kept us in some ways independent of thinking about those sort of questions, but then we actually started having students that were spending multiple years and eventually graduating from NuVu. And so some of our early students, Kate, Saeed, students that you mentioned, we really had to think about those pathways and what happens after, and how are we best preparing students for that after step. And I think that that's been really important to us as we have more and more full-time students, and that's becoming a big focus for NuVu's growth over time. And so a big part for us was developing our own transcripts and competencies that really related to our pedagogy and the way that we're thinking about what values we're trying to really build in the students, and how those competencies translate to our pedagogy. And over the years, we've kind of built a robust transcript system and assessment model that really reflects, again, the studio-based model. And that's a core part of allowing colleges, universities, or companies that are bringing our students on board as interns or other work opportunities to really understand the skills that students have learned, and those competencies, and how they can apply in settings outside of NuVu. So that's been really important to us, and it helps us communicate back to the students. Here are the skills that we're really looking to build. Here are the competencies. And that's been great for us and for the students to be able to speak a common language and really understand how students are growing in areas that they need to grow or be challenged in. So that's been a kind of a really key conversation and discussion and point about how we're also reassessing even our studio curriculum to really create a well-rounded student.
And you have 10 years of experience, so presumably you've got, I don't know, 6 or 7 years of students who completed their time at NuVu who have done something else in their life. Do you remain in contact with them? Are you getting feedback of how their NuVu experience has influenced what was next for them?
Yeah, they're actually in touch quite a bit. And I'd say, you know, it was interesting. We would have thought that maybe there would have been a lot of students, first of all, that might not have wanted to go to college and maybe taken an alternate path. But it turns out that I'd say maybe 98% of the students still chose and wanted to go to a 4 or 5 year college or university. And what was really, I think, good for a good number of them was NuVu also allowed them a space to explore what they're really interested in, passionate in, what they wanted to pursue in college, and really kind of understand themselves better through the types of studios that they were taking, and also build new interests. So we had a lot of students that go into engineering, design, media arts. And so I think those also fields, oftentimes they have a portfolio kind of application process that they've been able to develop a robust portfolio. But a lot of them, I think, for some of they sort of felt like, yes, I met my like match with the college. I know one of our first graduates, Kate, who's in her 4th year, and she was in the RISD Brown dual degree program doing her engineering at Brown and design at RISD. And for the first few years, she kind of really felt like, wait a minute, I thought there was going to be more to it from the design side at RISD. So she was feeling like it wasn't really challenging her as she thought. She was like, I learned a lot of this while at NuVu. I want the more advanced experience. And she thought it was not as integrated as she would have hoped, the dual degree programs. She sort of had to split her mind into two sections. So there's been some, I think, good critical kind of awareness from the students who are also in certain programs and realizing, you know what, I don't actually, I see some things that I would like to see in my college education that I'm not, and how can I create other opportunities for that? And that's what we've also been sort of sounding boards even in college for them. Like, okay, if you're not able to find those opportunities, how can you find like a fellowship? Or how can you apply for an interesting scholarship that will enable you to do what you want to do? And I think our students have been really, really good and proactive about, because they've had to be sort of self-reliant about figuring out what other possibilities there are. And we had one student who started an engineering program this past fall, and he actually left. He thought there was just academically, he's highly dyslexic, and it was going to be a challenging curriculum. And so he actually ended up now, with everything that's happening, he came back to Boston, and he's doing kind of a full-length internship with a company that's developing various devices that are supporting in the COVID-19 pandemic. And he's like a very hard-working, engineering-minded student, and he just went in, and that could be his pathway moving forward. So those are just a couple of examples.
So Susie's got an interesting question, and I'll take to both of you, but Leanne, the HSC, in other parts of the world, the HSC, and all of the other expectations of jumping through an awful lot of hoops to meet the Department of Education. How's that influencing your integration of project-based learning, and how much is that influencing teachers' hesitancy to dive deeper? Is that, maybe it's not, but
it is. I feel inspired listening to Saba, actually. Saba, that's what we would love to be able to do, is to get into that space. Some of the challenges we have when we consider our credential, which is in the last 2 years of school here, it is very, 120-hour courses. We need to make sure how we've met that in order to have our registration. Our registration is renewed every 5 years, conditioned on a whole lot of different things. So the playing that we're having at the moment with PBL is from our 4-year-olds up until the end of year 10. And we're not really touching 11 and 12 at the moment. One, really, because I feel like we've got to build the skills of staff. So because we didn't start out as a school who wants to be future focused, it's also about changing culture. So amongst our staff and digging into their beliefs and assumptions about what their role is as the teacher, and the student voice and all of those things. So that's really why for us the pandemic is a little bit of a blessing, because the government body that regulates curriculum came out a few weeks ago and said that for our year 11 and 12 that we were able to modify assessments or reduce them, and the 2 magic words of wherever possible, deliver broad. And so using those 2 words, wherever possible, we've used that to be a little bit more creative in the senior areas, but a whole lot more creative in the primary school and the lower secondary school as well, to be able to say, let's have a play. So 1, it's about engagement for young people, but 2, it is actually challenging our staff to begin to develop a gold standard PBL. We ended up going with PBL Works as our model that we base our learning on, because we thought that would work best within a subject while we're still in a traditional model. But these few weeks we're actually going completely cross-curricular. So trying to have that play while the opportunity exists. What is interesting is yesterday I had the leaders on site at school and opened up to any other staff to join us for a bit of a think tank. And my question that I threw out to them was, which is not new to probably anyone on this forum, but for some of our staff, we've had the discussion, but there was no sort of sense of urgency. But the question was, what are the skills and dispositions that our young people need to flourish in the new world? And that's beginning some really rigorous discussion and drawing out some things that we already know that we need to be doing, but maybe there hasn't been the drive or the urgency to actually make it the priority. So I'm looking forward to the next few weeks, although the government announced this last week that we're supposed to stagger students on site for 1 day a week, which is going to be really interesting. So that's the new opportunity to solve in the next couple of days.
Yeah, I've been wondering how American schools are going to comply with the CDC recommendation that no groups greater than 10 be assembled.
Wow.
So was, I mean, like, what, 1/3 of your school shows up and sits in a room and then 3 days later they come again, or, I don't know. It's going to be an interesting, if there's a return. Susie's wonder was, I wonder how many school systems can say that their assessment system reflects their core values. And I'm just curious about what the 2 of you think of that. Do you feel that alignment is there, or do you feel it's attainable? Where are you in that regard?
Yeah, I can definitely say for NuVu, for our homeschool location, it was really important that the assessment framework, that we developed it based on the values and mission of the school. And it grows and evolves over time. I think the bigger challenge has been talking about and implementing assessment in our NuVuX partner schools that we work with, where we work in some schools where there's AP classes running, and honors classes, and then you might have NuVu, a studio course taking place, and integrated into the schedule. And sometimes you'll see it's not even a blended, but it's truly going from one world to the next, and for the students to also reconcile in terms of how you're assessing two very different models and ways of learning. In other schools, they're sort of shifting and reworking their assessment from a traditional graded system to maybe one that's competency-based. And in some schools that we operate in, we work with a public school in California here, and it's a STEM academy, and they, from the very start, we've been partnered with them, and they built a competency-based framework for the school. So NuVu, the studio, is part of an integrated curriculum that fits alongside with science and language arts and math. And there you can see that the assessment and the competencies really model and reflect well NuVu's pedagogy. So we have to kind of migrate in all of these different conditions, and I think that that's where it can prove very challenging across the board for students, especially if they're trying to really understand how their learning is assessed given these different environments, sometimes operating within the same school. So I think those bring about real questions, and that we as a partner have to engage with the school, with the teachers, and with the students, and and it's an ongoing process.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the truth.
Yeah, Leanne, you chuckled when I asked that question. So
yeah, well, I think what comes to the fore is if you have quite a traditional mindset around I teach, they learn, and then I summatively assess their learning, then that departs from that is very, very challenging for that way of thinking. And so the principles of assessment can actually be quite open, but whether that's what's being delivered in classrooms can be quite different. And that's for me where it really all comes back to beliefs and assumptions, because I think in all the years I've been a school leader, we can do all sorts of initiatives and work on culture and all of those things. But if we're not actually digging into beliefs and assumptions, you don't actually make any long-term change. Yeah, so that's the beautiful thing about being able to have a bit of a play at the moment, is to encourage people to have a go and not feel worried about they'll get in trouble because they're not meeting what they're supposed to be meeting, which I think will build confidence.
Mm-hmm. I've mentioned in other settings that there's a school in Philadelphia called the Workshop School, and it's at West Philly High. Kids have done amazing things there for the last 10 years or more. And they are operating within the very bureaucratic Philadelphia public school system. And the Philadelphia public school system was expecting either letter or numeric grades. And that's really all they wanted, and probably accounting for how many days a student was in attendance. And what they did was essentially create a little black box assessment algorithm and said, we're going to stick to the way that we know we're providing helpful feedback to the young people that we're working with that develops their potential. And all of those words will go into this little black box, and what will spit out on the other side is some bit of numbers or letters that the bureaucracy wants. But our kids don't see those letters or numbers, and the teachers don't see them either. It's just the bureaucrats that see them. And I think NuVu, I don't know whether it was NuVu, but there was another school that had kind of figured out a way to create a transcript that was acceptable to in other settings, but didn't compromise the core way of working and expectations of, back to Suzie's question of aligning your assessment and with your values.
That's probably one of our what we are trying to work in that space is how do we create almost like a translation document for what's required by the governing bodies that doesn't stifle what we passionately believe needs to happen. What's exciting is probably in the last week, rather than a couple of voices having that conversation, there's actually a few more voices now as part of our community that are actually saying maybe we need to have individual education plans for everybody to cater for the varying needs. And that's pretty exciting to hear that there's now more people interested in thinking outside the square, and rather than saying it's too hard, maybe we can think creatively about how we can achieve this.
Nice. So another thought that I had, Saba, was this alignment between values and assessment and all that. You're operating now in many locations. You started in a single location, and frankly, you started in the Boston area with a cradle of pre-K to 22 education. What's happened to your model when you're operating in 2 locations in Turkey or in Mumbai or Tampa, Florida, or wherever, how has it remained the same? How much has it been modified to work in those other settings?
Yeah, I think that, again, the core principles in terms of the creative learning being at the forefront is something we try very hard never to compromise on. And that comes through, we have a team of who we call our NuVu Fellows that are on site and partnered with teachers at each of our schools. And they kind of help bring that culture and infuse it into the school's culture, and vice versa. The school's culture also impacts kind of what's happening in the studio. And we try and keep a connection between the schools. So we've been doing a number of virtual studio exchanges between the Cambridge site and the school in Florida, or the school in Kansas and the school in Turkey have a virtual studio exchange. And that's also a way for us to keep the culture not just within Boston, but have it sort of permeate and allow students to kind of connect and build and support each other as they're going through this process, which might seem kind of unusual to them depending on what type of school they're in, what type of environment, what type of past experiences they've had working in this way. I think one of the really interesting things is we've definitely been challenged to think outside of just the sort of purist approach, where in Cambridge we do this from, we have studio from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. Monday through Friday. And for a long time we held fast to that students need to be immersed in this and that's all they're doing. But obviously partnering with schools, the students have all different types of subjects, and I'd say all of the schools except for one, NuVu is sort of, as I mentioned, a part of other courses that students are taking. And so NuVu might be taking place for 2 hours every other day in a block schedule, or every day for an hour. In one school, they're doing the fully immersive model where they have kind of a full semester of NuVu for 4 days a week. And we also have, what's been really exciting, I think, has been all of the partnerships with teachers. And so we might be partnered with an astronomy teacher or a history teacher or engineering teacher. And so the way that we think about the studio curriculum and focus is also built around that teacher's expertise and background. And so that's been really interesting for us, is to have these teachers who have lots of experience, or have really passions in certain areas, and our fellows get to partner with them. So it really extends, I think, the types of kind of studios that we've done and the way that we're able to structure those studios. Sometimes we'll begin a studio with a lot of research, if we partner with a biology teacher, and spend like the first 4 weeks of the semester diving deep into kind of the research aspect of looking at kind of the local context in the town of Woodstock in Vermont, and understanding how climate change might be affecting different native populations of species. And then that translates, and then the next half of the semester is really spent kind of taking that insight and actually building a device that visualizes that change in some way that's interactive and tactile. So, you know, that's just one example, but so we're able to really think in a different time scale too, because now we're not bound, or most of our studios in Cambridge are 3 weeks, and now we have a full semester, or it could be a trimester, depending on the schedule of the school. So it's allowed us to actually break out of even the model that we have, and to really think about how we can work in all of these different time contexts and scheduling contexts, and with teacher expertise. And that's been really interesting. And also the cultural context has been really fascinating. We have 2 schools that we work with in Hawaii, and one of the schools is Kamehameha schools, and kind of the cultural Native heritage is very important and is brought into many of the subjects, and especially in the context of the studio work that the students are doing. And that's a core part of the learning, is how do you blend in the history of the place and the site and the people, and bring it into even a contemporary topic, like thinking about body enhancements, cyborg enhancements. So there's this like very interesting merger of discussions that can happen given the specificity of the school.
Hours ago, we were speaking with Wei-Jing Wu at Elliott Innovation School, and she has NuVu Fellows there.
Yes.
And they do, she explained the nature of the way things flow there. What occurs to me is that the balance between maintaining a certain culture within NuVu and adapting it to these other settings in some ways is similar to a change that's happening for Leanne, and I see John's on the call too, within the Adventist schools in New South Wales, is finding resources amongst the schools, instead of thinking of each school operating on its own, but saying, oh, if we're doing something, whether it's working effectively or not, part of our collective culture is to then share that out with the other settings in order to kind of grow the overall capacity, instead of what we typically do is just, you know, the edge of the property is the edge of the culture, and instead of thinking of the broader view there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd say that this, say maybe it's a challenging time period, I think, for education, but there's what it's even allowed us to do, the fact that everyone is virtual right now, it kind of creates a big possibility for that sharing of resources, or having kind of experts or others outside of education be more accessible and available to students. And that's been a kind of, or even our fellows in our network have been a resource to one another in supporting the studio programs that are taking place in other places. And I think that happened, but it happened much less
Mm-hmm.
before the pandemic, and now it's actually kind of, and this desire for actually wanting to again connect with people because
Mm-hmm.
people feel isolated, that they're also more eager and to be involved and to help support something.
Yeah, nice. So I have an opportunity, you tell me if this is appropriate or not. So Andrea wasn't able to join us, but I do have a link to the videos that the kids produce. They produce a television show. Leanne, how big is Toronto? 50 kids, maybe at the most?
Yeah, max.
Yeah. And so it's essentially, it's a school that runs as a lower elementary and upper elementary, or lower primary, upper primary. And so it's a mixed age classroom. I think it's year three through 6 maybe, and then a K2 or something. And I was interviewed. I will not show the interview of me, but if I could just show a little excerpt of it, it would be a way of pulling them in and just bringing the voice of our learners back into this conversation. And then Suzie is up next. So let me see if I can do this correctly. And here, oops. It doesn't like that. Well, all I can tell you is that it's lovely. I'll just really briefly describe what they do with this Toronto Campus News. Students identify all of the different roles that are needed in order to produce a television news program on their campus. They develop resumes and they submit applications for the jobs. They interview for the jobs, and then they're placed in various roles. And the wonder of it is that if there's 20 kids working on this, there are 20 jobs. There are kids who are out doing the field reporting. There's somebody writing an article for the next newscast. Somebody's in charge of the camera. There's the talent behind the desk. Somebody else has to set up the desk and the green screen and the lighting and everything else. And every single kid was actively engaged in that moment. And I think in the 32 minutes that I was witnessing all of this, including my interview, every child knew exactly where to go and get this and double check this, and the guy who's being interviewed from America needs some powder on his face and a glass of cold water, and the dynamic amongst all of them was just delightful. And then they disassembled the thing and put it away back in another place. But it was obvious to them obvious to me and to Andrea, that this is the way in which they're learning all of these other skills, whether it's writing, communicating, the interpersonal skills, everything else was all through that project. And the fact that it could be rapidly deployed and rapidly dismantled made it quite impressive. The video that I would have loved to show was just a typical newscast. They're talking about the new plover chicks that are out on the pitch. They talk a little bit about their garden. They talk about who was competing in the athletic performances in the area, et cetera. It was really an example of what's possible to do even in a tiny little isolated school like that. Any other quick thought from either of you before we bring Suzie on? Well,
that was a great description. It was very vivid. Like, I got a sense of the video without watching it.
Yeah, we'll make sure we get the link in there somehow. Well, I continue to be impressed by the evolution of NuVu and the evolution of all the Adventist schools in New South Wales. And so 2015, Leanne, when you and Rum and Rowan and I know there were more people there met, it was only 5 years ago. And you've been doing an awful lot. And Saba says she's only been at it for 10. So, you know, I mean, I think that's, you know, we're all working towards higher levels of engagement, relevance, et cetera. So I'm glad you're both on those journeys, and it was really nice to have you here with us.
Thanks for having us. It's been great to listen to everybody.
Yeah, thank you. And I will find that link and put it in the chat. So thank you.
Thank you.